I am now formally beginning. And in the most circuitous way, we're going to be moving into things. I can close off the poll on mine, right?
Yeah, I got it. It's gone.
No, not on my screen. Because the artist we're going to look at today, this Sonia Delaunay, sometimes you're going to find her called Delaunay Turk. Her dates are, she's almost coterminous with Georgia O'Keeffe, or maybe 2 years difference in their age. But Sonia Delaunay fits within the category that is just avowedly modern. I mean, wanting to express the modern age. And then I thought as we, and then we'll be, the rest of the artists will be too, that I deal with, that I want to go back and look at some men and look at what the concept of modern would mean. Especially, this is something that sort of burst open like a flower around the beginning of the 20th century. And 1900 to 1920, the whole theme of what is modern and how to be modern was a great preoccupation in all the arts. So I have some sort of entertaining images, and then we will gradually work into Sonia's work. But for modern, I still myself, and certainly with students I'm aware, that when you talk about 20th century art in movements that are non-figurative, non-objective, abstract, to people, that work still looks very modern, even though it's over 100 years old. So what was the sense of being modern? I mean, what were people thinking about that they weren't just saying, oh, I live now, but I live in a new age, a modern age. Well, one of the things, of course, was industrialization, urbanization, and then the tempo and the nature of daily life just seemed to change so much. And one of the things that was especially striking was speed. And I'm going back to the middle of the 19th century for an image here. This is one of the early steam locomotives. This is a train in Liverpool, England, lithograph of it, I think, from the 1830s. And this was a remarkable thing. It went 10 miles an hour. Here's William Mallard Turner's painting from the 40s. So, well, it's about 15 years later than that locomotive was chugging along. And this is called Rain, Steam, and Speed. And this shows you how much to people that was a sense of enormous speed as this is coming, rushing toward us out of the haze of the steam. There's actually somewhere down here a little rabbit bounding ahead of it on. But the idea on the diagonal and just this enormous, impetuous movement of the. So that was their perception of what this provided.
Excuse me, Maggie, you might want to put it in slideshow.
Oh, it's not. Isn't that interesting? Of course I do. We had to go through this before. So there's the rapid locomotive and Turner's Rain, Steam, and Speed. And closer to the end of the 19th century, here's the first gas-powered car by Karl Benz in Mannheim, Germany. And this went 30 miles an hour. So looking at the forms of this, it's very much an engineer's design. It's pleasing design, I think. And these are forms that are going to appear in a lot of early 20th century art. Interested in speed, these radiating spokes, this cycling movement, just the whole, think of these in motion like a bicycle wheel. It's going to be kind of an image that, a motif that appears. And another one was a complete transformation made by electric lights. This is London in the early 1880s when they had arc lights. They were very powerful. This is when there was, I think it used direct current, and they were dangerous. They just swallowed up power, but they had this brilliant light.
I didn't hear the beginning, so I don't know why she's doing this as not women artists right now.
All right.
No, this is all a prelude to women artists. And then this is New York City in 1888, when a great blizzard. They wanted you to see what an electrified city, all these lines. Now these images of lines, radiating lines, and anything to present the idea of motion are themes that are going to come up. And one last one from the late 19th century that is another part of defining what modernity is, I want to show is the Eiffel Tower, which was the tallest building in the world until the building of the Chrysler building. And its design was by an engineer, not an architect. At the top, it was a radio tower. So there's a transmission of information by means that aren't visible. And there was electricity transmitted by means that weren't always visible. There's a sense of energy, change, connection over great distances, things inconceivable before. There was also the first transatlantic flight across the English Channel in 1909, then the first transatlantic flight in 1919. So the contracting, speeding world, now a world of motion, in living in cities where you can walk down the street and not see anybody you know. Whereas if you came from a rural background, the rarity was to find someone that you didn't know. So there was just this, somehow it was almost like a tipping point with a turn to 1900. And there was within the visual arts a sense that we too need to be modern. And Sonia Delaunay Turk, who's the girl here at the middle, a Russian-born artist who is considered now French because she spent her whole adult career in France, was one of the women who was a pioneer in this change. So she's forever affiliated with her husband, Robert Delaunay. They collaborated essentially for about 30 years as artists till he died in 41. And she continued to work until almost her death. So her career is going to exemplify a new role for women artists. And it was the Russian women who were especially interested in modernism. They played, say, an American or French-born artists. There weren't as many who had as radical a break with what was done before. So now we will start with her, and then I will be mixing her work in with Picasso and her husband's, and then gradually we'll be moving just into hers. But to tell you something about her background, she was from the Ukraine, and she was from a medium-sized family, but a poor Jewish family. Her mother, however, had a brother named Henry Turk, whom you see here, who had moved to St. Petersburg, and he was a very prosperous lawyer. So Sonia, who at birth her name was Sarah Stern, Sarah was sent to live with her uncle and aunt. Her aunt's name is Anne and Henry. And And they doted on her. She was a very young child when she first arrived there. She never saw her mother again, but they doted on her. They provided her an unusually good education. They themselves were very urbane. They traveled around in Europe. They spent summer vacations in Finland. They provided everything possible for Sonia. And Sonia went to a very good women's equivalent of high school, where she had a teacher who recognized her artistic talent and told Sonia's aunt and uncle, who by then had adopted her, that it would be a very good thing for Sonia to have a wider exposure to good art training. And they decided to send her to an art school in Karlsruhe in Germany. She went when she was 18, and she studied there for several years. Then after 2 years, she moved to Paris, where Mary Cassatt and, well, Americans, emigres from all over were coming, because that was the avowed, acknowledged art capital of the Western world. And she went to an art school there, but she had no particular fondness for what she learned there, but instead she went around to the galleries, and she was very curious about whatever the newest art was. In her wandering around in Paris, she met this man, Wilhelm Uhde, U-H-D-E, who was a Polish-born, well, we'd say now Poland, but a German. He owned a gallery. He was a critic. He was something of a poet. He was very interested in the arts, and he had a gallery in Paris where he showed some early Picasso. And in fact, this is Uhde, and this is Picasso's portrait of him. And Derain, and especially he was interested in the neo-primitive artist, Douanier Rousseau, and I'll show you some works by Rousseau. So he had the most avant-garde work. And Sonia was looking at that. She became a good friend of Wilhelm Uhde, and they decided to marry. And now this was a marriage of convenience, because he was homosexual at a time when that would, in the circles of people who would be buying art, bring on great social opprobrium. So it was a way for him to sort of conceal his interests. And it was also a marriage of convenience for Sonia, because her aunt was insisting that she return to Russia and threatening to sort of cut off her very ample allowance if she didn't return. But since Sonia married, she had access to her dowry, and her aunt could no longer force her to come. So she was able to stay in Paris. So she's a strong-willed and wealthy young woman. Here, this is a work by Rousseau that I thought you would know, that this primitive artist that Uhde was interested in. So that's in the MoMA. So Uhde arranged an exhibition of Sonia's work, and she began to call herself Sonia once she moved to Paris. So these are paintings from 1907, 1908, and they just manifest how greedily and how thoroughly she took in what were the currents of the most recent art in Paris. This is just called a sleeping girl, with this very bright color and this dark, bold blue outlines. What does that reflect? To some degree, the art of Gauguin, who also used these very pronounced outlines. And with the coloration, the very strong coloring, and also, like Matisse. Here's another one of hers called The Finnish Woman. These are works that were in that first exhibition she had of hers. She did this, she's just 22. With these strong outlines and these color patches, you see that she loves color. And other than her native interest in color, her innate interest in color, what is there that's new that's provoking her or inspiring that is the work of Matisse. Now, Matisse, when his works were being shown, was something of a laughingstock to the general public. This is Matisse's portrait of his wife from 1905. But you see those color patches, especially even just separate color patches here. Now, what Matisse is doing, this is that phase that the critics called, he's a fauve, which meant just the wild animals. Matisse is making an assertion about color, that color, painted color, can be whatever the artist wants to paint. An image does not have to be somehow a veristic representation of the visible world. That it can be whatever the artist wants it to be. There is at this time now, of course, although in black and white, there is photography and there are movies, and artists are playing and moving into the thought that there's no longer an absolute necessity to represent the visible world. They can explore new territories as much as any scientist is exploring a new territory. And here, this is one of Matisse's explorations. This is Sonia's again. And also in that exhibition, just called the Yellow Nude. It's quite an asexual nude. I came across something that just was interesting to me, that since it was in Russia, where there are a number of women who were very interested in moving toward this kind of abstract art, there was they had a condition a little bit different from what was for even most women at that time studying in Europe. They still in Russia were not being able to study the nude in art school. So there's, this is just a kind of an androgynous figure, and it's just various forms. There's not an attempt to present a realistic rendition of her, but that's the negative thing behind it. But what else is this? Matisse's Blue Nude, or Memories of Biskra, it's called. This is in the Baltimore Museum of Art. And it was in the Armory Show in Manhattan in 1913. But this painting caused a storm of derision when he showed this in 1907. And when the public, he was charged like, I would run away if I ever saw a woman like that. And he made some rather suave comment that he would too, but this wasn't a woman, this was a painting in which he's studying color and form. So you see how she's understanding that. She's daring that. The other painting from 1907, that's one of the really seminal years, is the one you know, and when you go to the modern, that's the Demoiselles d'Avignon. That was by many considered the breakthrough year for Picasso into Cubism, almost into Cubism, in this very large painting that you see here. Who's equally asserting that a painting, he's not painting women, he's painting a painting. And his interest is even more later, not so much about the paint, the color, but the forms. And another part of the exploration that's the hallmark of Cubism is that there's why try to show illusionistic space? Why do a painter need to suggest something that's three-dimensional, going back of a real world? I mean, that's a lie anyway, and those themes do no longer need to be represented in painting. There are other means, there are other people have access to those. So he's working with that. He's also interested in just breaking out of the Western tradition by looking at, for example, masks from the French territories in Africa that have been brought back, and he's seeing them in a museum, or faces that are based on primitive Spanish sculpture, just reaching outside the canon of standard Western art. Next part. So she's exposed to all that through her marriage to Uda and through walking the streets. And Uda was friends with a number of these artists. They would stop by, they wanted to have their works shown. And one of the people who stopped by his gallery was this young man, Robert Delaunay, whose mother was very interested in art and who was even more obsessed with her son, whose career she wanted him to be a star. Now, he'd had just 2 years of training in theatrical design, so he had far less artistic background or less training than Sonia did. But here, his mother bought this Rousseau, a very famous painting called the Snake Charmer. So she was very interested in the most modern art. So he came to the gallery with his mother once and met Sonia, and they were very soon having an affair. She got pregnant. The marriage of convenience to Uda. There was a divorce, I think it was 2 months after that. Robert and Sonia got married, and then about 5 or 6 months later, she gave birth to their only child, a son named Charles. But from that time on, 1910, 1911, they are as one, as you could even see in this portrait. I don't know if any of you have looked in the New Yorker. If you have the New Yorker, there's a wonderful review of by Hilton Alls of the Alice Neal show that's opened up at the Met. But there's one comment he wrote in there that was so fitting for this. He's talking about Alice Neal in terms of the conventional role of a woman artist. And he's saying, he was a nice white lady artist, and is saying, who went wherever the male painters went and helped make those guys' stories happen first. So it's help make those guys' stories happen first is the part that pertains to Sonia. So as I say, her career and her husband's are bound together. Now, here is a painting that Robert did in 1909. You see, he's faceting the figure a little bit like Picasso and some other sort of proto-cubists. But if you just, and it's a good likeness of him, evidently, but it's pretty incoherent as a painting. There's that Matisse-like vivid color, and even like that Matisse vivid colors in the background. But look how he's making it into sort of cubes. This part of the painting doesn't look at all like it has much to do with this. Actually, Matisse had done that a little bit too. But so he, like Sonia, is just avidly interested in what's going on. This is a Picasso from that same year, 1909. It's called A Woman with a Pear. And here you see the difference between Picasso and Robert Delaunay, which would be between Picasso and Sonia as well. Picasso is not, he's interested in form, in suggesting shapes and going back and forth in shapes. They sort of come out toward you, but not in color. Robert Delaunay was lifelong competitive with Picasso in the view of posterity, of course, Picasso is head and shoulders far better artist. But Delaunay, one of his comments about Picasso's work, his disparaging comments, oh, he paints with cobwebs. Now, this is another Picasso from 1911. So that's Sonia and Delaunay have just married. This is moving even more into the cobwebs and into the fractured forms. This is what Robert Delaunay is doing. He does a series on the Eiffel Tower. Now he's somewhat breaking up forms, but he certainly has more color. And one of the things that he criticized Picasso for was that Picasso just paints things like musical instruments and fruit and people. He doesn't paint the modern world. So this is such an embrace of modernity, this great building and these new skyscrapers. He's not the first to see, and he does a number on the Eiffel Tower, a whole series of paintings. He's not the first to have done that. Seurat in the 1880s has as well. In this one, this shows the Eiffel Tower before it was quite finished at the top. But I wouldn't bring this in if it were just to say, oh, Seurat had also done the Eiffel Tower, but it is because this technique in which Seurat is working that is going to be very important. It is that what he called divisionism, where colors are broken into small particles of pure color, and opposite colors are placed one next to another. Now, this is something that comes from a much earlier 19th century theoretician of color and scientist, Emile Chevreul, who wrote a book on the contrast of colors, things that we learn early in school but were new at that time, such as, he essentially invented the color wheel, saying that colors are opposite one another when placed next to each other. If you have a red and a green next to adjacent, the red is going to look redder, the green is going to look greener. So he's studying the optical effects of color. And that's called the law of simultaneous contrasts, because the contrast increases when they're placed next to one another. And that's accounts for what he does here. So Seurat is trying to, in his paintings, bring into the world of art those theories. And here's another page from that work where Chevreul, he was actually working for a tapestry factory when he was interested in colors. But this is the same orange in here as it is in here. I'm just saying how different that looks depending on the colors adjacent to it. So he's studying color from a purely scientific way, studying light and studying the vision, the eye on optics. And that feeds into what happens. And the other thing that has, and here we come back to Sonia. I would imagine someone who just started this lecture now saying modern women artists and saying this looks like ill-pressed, ill-sewed object. I say, what? This is by Sonia. It's a blanket that she made for the baby carriage of their new baby out of scraps of cloth they had around the apartment, their very spacious apartment, because she had money, I remember. And this is 1911. Let's see if I can have here what she said about this. She said, about 1911, I had the idea of making for my son, who'd just been born, a blanket composed of bits of fabric like those I had seen in the houses of Ukrainian peasants. When it was finished, the arrangements of the pieces of material seemed to me to evoke Cubist conceptions. And we, get the we, so that's going to be she and her husband, tried to apply the same process to other objects and paintings. Now, if you want to consider this as art, here is the terminology we use now. This is no longer abstract art because the terms get used loosely, but abstract is abstracting from something in the visible world. It has some kernel of visible reality behind it. This is non-representational, or sometimes called non-objective. Now, not objective in the sense of biased versus objective, but having no object in it. That this is an object that is purely and simply blocks of color. And she, too, of course, is aware that if you look carefully, the light colors are going to look like they come forward, the dark colors go back. Our human eye is unable to see something as fully flat. We, as a matter of survival, translate what we see in color into forms that have some place in the three-dimensional world. And so this, you can see this is going forward or backward. Those are quilts by the Gee's Bend in Alabama from the first half of the 20th century. So she knew this from Ukrainian quilts, but this patching, see, these are in an art museum too. She just had the eye to see that this was not just exigency of using scraps, but of something that had a visual, provocative, interesting value. So she and Robert begin to move more and more into that. This is again Robert Delaunay. He did a series called Open Windows as this one, and now it's color. There's just this line maybe, and this line you could see is that faint reminiscence of the Eiffel Tower with its placement in the center of the picture. But unlike Picasso, with his sharp-edged, fragmented forms, where he shows shadow and then highlighted areas, here, what he's doing it is all through color. I think one of the most striking ones is this right here. Doesn't this look like a corner of something that's coming toward us? One side in shadow. Well, no, it's just a different color. Looks like forms overlapping one another. No, it's just a shift in color. So this is what Robert Delaunay and Sonia Delaunay had that the standard Cubists or the followers of Picasso did not, is a full appreciation of the importance of color and the ability to color to speak, to create form out of nothing but color. And kind of a richness that Picasso's paintings didn't. And there was one friend of Picasso's who was a poet, Apollinaire, who was drawn to this very much. And he was on the outs for various reasons with Picasso. He even came to live with the Delaunays for a while. And he gave a name to this new way of painting. He called it Orphism, like Orpheus, the mythological singer, musician, whose wife he lost because he looked back at her where he was bringing her out of Hades. Because Apollinaire, who was not a painter himself, but he wanted to be in the center of every artistic I mean, he didn't want to be in the center of the art world. He wrote about this a lot, and he even wrote a poem that sort of to evoke these paintings. He said, well, it's like Orpheus. There's music in this. There's visual pleasure, there's music, there's space, there's depth, there's everything you need in a painting right here. Robert and Sonia did not so much like this title, Orphism, for it. It sounds wonderfully recondite. They just called it simultaneism, like things simultaneous adjacent colors. Well, that came from that scientist who had talked about simultaneous colors. See, these are opposite colors on the pole. And then here's the last one we look at, I think almost the last by Robert. Finally, he did do something that was just totally non-representational. He did this disc. It's about 50 inches across. And that's 1914. Now, there was a woman who'd done things like that before. That's Hilma af Klint. You might have seen her show at the Guggenheim. This is actually a painting she did maybe a year later than that, without awareness of it. But so there were artists doing things that were totally non-representational, but they were generally works meant to carry out some sort of present a metaphysical idea about a higher reality, something in another dimension beyond the physical world. And there are a group of artists who work in this non-objective way, always finding it as an expression of this other greater reality, because they're trying to avoid, very much trying to avoid the sense of being just decorative, having their work just be dismissed as decorative. Now here we're with Sonia again. She does this painting called 1913. This is about 11 feet long. You can tell she still has money. I mean, it costs money. Picasso's struggling and doing those small things in a small space, and she has this big studio. So this is called the Bal Bullier. I'll show it to you from the front. And this is the building. It's a dance hall where she and Robert like to go. And there was new electric lights in here. There, a lot of people dancing. The new dance was the tango. So she does this painting to represent it. This you would still say is abstract because there are forms you can recognize in here. This would be a dancing couple, a dancing couple, a dancing couple. See these new lights up here? This is the close dancing of the tango. But largely she's working in the colors as he does. And here's more work she does. Well, let me just go beyond that. My goodness, what's that? Closer detail. She made herself a dress to go dancing. So she made a simultaneous dress, and here it is. She made costumes for her husband too. She couldn't leave any surface undecorated. She was constantly busy with this sort of creative eye. And there she is wearing it. And this is her painting from 1913. A sort of a looser, brushier technique, but you see how much like Robert's. So they're working in tandem. Then this is her work. I will show you some details from it. It's quite an interesting thing. It's it's well over 6 feet tall. It's an artist's book that she and a poet named Cendrar, C-E-N-D-R-A-R-S, composed. He wrote a poem on that supposedly is a record of taking the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Moscow over to the China end of the Trans-Siberian and Harbin. But then it's not very realistic, and with a young prostitute named Jehan, because then it goes to the North Pole and circles back and ends in Paris. Now, I have to give you some sections so you get a sense of how this works. So he wrote the poetry, and then she does, of course, all the painting. This is called a first simultaneous book. You see the colors go over. Here you see it on the side. It folded. So it's sort of accordion pleated, and like a map, you can fold it over here, and then it would go into a cover that she hand painted. Then I'll give you a couple of the sections of it. At the top, there's the actual map of the route in the beginning of the timetable. And then on his side, you see sometimes the type changes color, it changes typeface and size. It moves from one side, from one margin to the other margin. So there are visual qualities to the text that also help to integrate it with the images. See the colors go across there. This, you see the whole length together. They had planned originally to do, I think it was 150 of these, only 60 were printed. The Museum of Modern Art has one, and Rutgers owns one as well. So that's the top panel, and this is the bottom panel, which I will also show you. The reason they wanted to do 150 of them is that then if they were all placed end to end, they would be as tall as the Eiffel Tower. There's the top, the cover, and the bottom. With the Eiffel Tower, and this I'll show you in a photograph in a minute, is a Ferris wheel that was close to the Eiffel Tower. So the whole thing is grounded or comes to the end in the center of the most modern city and that symbol of the most modern life. And you can see something of the variety in the text. There's the Ferris wheel. I think this is still closer to abstract than non-representational art. She did several paintings that were just called electric prisms, but there is an evocation of the life in Paris, the night, like these radiating circles at the top. You can think of that as if it were from a street light, this dazzling arcs. And this is sort of two people down here, and something you can recognize, a form here. That's like a kiosk. You know, you get newspapers and magazines, and she's written Sendrar's name right here. It's the best I could come up with for a kiosk. See, her works tend to be a little brushier than her husband's. But think of all the decisions that are made about which color to place next to which. Without that security of looking at something in the world and saying, okay, I'm going to replicate that color, or I'm going to make a variation on that color. No, you do this out of your own soul, your own eye. So the poet Apollinaire, who, as I say, had to have his finger in every pie in terms of contemporary French art in Paris, was also playing around with the idea that what would be modern in poetry. He said one form of new poetry might be advertising posters, the text. That was the new poetic language, the new abbreviated language. And so she, in 1914, sort of plays with that, she does this painting that was to be for a poster of the aperitif du Bonnet. Now, it only was a painting. I think she played with the idea of it being something that would be commercially available, but it was only done as a painting. So that's a great surge of work, 1913, 14. They took a trip. She's still an affluent woman. They went to the Mediterranean. They went to Spain and Portugal. And World War I broke out. So they were isolated there. I'll show you a little work that she did there. And that's going to lead to a major change because then from the French Revolution, they no longer have access to her income. She did this painting. It's called The Portuguese Market. I think, again, you sort of see a person here and here. The colors are very rich. And then they were experimenting with mixing the pigment with wax to make the colors even brighter. And here's one her husband did at the same time. You see, he's more wedded to realism than she is. It's just called The Large Portuguese Woman. Less decipherable in hers. So in Spain, where they're stuck, she made the acquaintance of Sergei Diaghilev, who had the Ballet Russe company, was also stranded in Madrid. And she struck up an acquaintance with him. He's also very important in the creation of modern art as well as modern dance and his espousal of modern music. Chagall, Matisse, Picasso, other painters did both costume and stage design for him. And she designed costumes for the ballet Cleopatra. This is one of her costumes. And there's another one. So that's taking her further in the world of clothing. She also established 3 shops called Casa Sonia, where she sold clothing of her own design and housewares and home textiles. Because it was her inheritance that provided their income before. But from now on, largely, she turns to commercial art, and it's hard to know how much it is because she was interested in fabrics, as she always had been, and how much it is because she has to or wants to support Robert's career. That's where the matter of the balance in the marriage or the role of the woman becomes an issue. And they're back in Paris now, 1924. This is their apartment. She's decorated the door. She's written a poem on the door. I mean, she was into everything. This is Robert's studio, still a spacious studio. This is a painting he did commemorating the first transatlantic flight. But there's Sonia, and I don't know if these were friends or it looked to me more like these are models. She began to design textiles, and she worked with several Parisian designers and established her own store called the Atelier Simultaneous. That's in English, which is what they preferred to call their paintings. There she is in front of a painting she did called 3 Women. And that center woman, you see is this coat, which she designed for Gloria Swanson. She was very successful as a textile designer. And she did design some clothing, but they're largely they're not shaped clothing. So she's considered an influence on modern women's clothing primarily. bathing suits, towels, shoes, a fur coat, even a car. This is her husband's work from that same time. He's showing a wife of a Jacques Heim, a major designer, and she's wearing fabric by Sonia draped over her arm. That's not a very fine painting. There was a major exhibition of Sonia's work at the Tate Modern in 2015, and it was largely of her fabrics, which nowadays are treated also as an art form. This is again that issue of, oh, that's women's work, it's just cloth. Well, that's not as important as what men are doing on canvas. And it's a statement of, other than that, well, it's just. And then in the 30s, she did this for a fair in 1937 in Paris of modern industry. And she did this of propellers. So she was capable of doing other works, but largely she stayed with fabrics. This is by her in the 30s. One aspect that I was thinking of as interesting to me is when you look at the dimensions of, these are square paintings. She often uses square. So what? Well, think about when you use your phone and you're going to take a photograph, you can have portrait view or landscape view. You know, the paintings tend to be, if it's a person, it's an upright rectangle. In landscape, it's horizontal rectangle. Square lifts it from either of those connotations of things of the real world. It's just a square patch. This is a rug she designed. And this is in the 1960s. And the last one I'm going to show you by her, playing cards. So, do we say she sacrificed herself to her husband? She chose to do what she wanted? That it's old-fashioned and ridiculous and sexist to say that doing paintings is a far more exalted occupation than to do color on not canvas, but on other fabrics that could be worn. You know, it's not a woman who did it first. You think of the arts and crafts movement and William Morris, who designed fabrics, textiles. So it actually began with a man. So next time, I'm actually 2 minutes early, but I will too. Next time I'm going to move off this in two directions with two other women who do also use the idea of what you do with cloth matters. Helen Frankenthaler, who stains right into the canvas as an abstract expressionist. And then I thought also, we might take some modern quilts and do Faith Ringgold. So we will take two other modern women. And then after that, as I said, there will be, or the blurb said that there would also look some photographers, some sculptors, and some architects. Now, if you have any questions, unmute or do a chat, and I'll take them.
Maggie, this
Yes.
is Pat Pello. I just wanted to say I had never heard of her, and this has been such an exciting hour.
Oh,
I love her work. Thank you.
Yeah, and I should say her paintings are big. There is nothing, you know, like retiring, modest. I mean, they are massive, bold statements. Yeah.
Are the playing cards a painting or a carpet or?
No, she designed playing cards. And this is her provisional sketch for them.
Oh, I see.
So she wanted to color these forms out everywhere.
Well, I love it.
Good. Yeah, so when actually we could have done a whole series on just the Russian women artists because they are a force to be reckoned with. They did things that are far more innovative, sort of that didn't have the whole Western tradition hanging on their shoulders the way that Mary Cassatt did, for example.
It's been a delightful time and inspiring, to say the least. Thank you.
Yeah.
You can
Thank
get
you
up to
so
paint
much.
Yeah, okay. Well, and questions, I loved that you like it, but I also, if you have questions, especially if you send me down the rabbit hole, like, oh, what about this? And I have to find out something. I do enjoy that as well.
Can we find examples of her art on the web?
Oh, yes, there's a lot. And I believe there are a couple of her works on display on the 5th floor at the Modern. They're just part of the regular collection.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that book, which is the most audacious thing, can you imagine making a book thinking that dreaming of having a book that if you put copy on one end to the other, it's going to be as tall as the Eiffel Tower. I love that. I love that. So that they can't show that all the time, but it's wonderful.
The real sense of play throughout all of it.
Yes, yes.
I'm wondering how she would have been if she hadn't had all that financial background, and she was able to just take the time and play around with this. If she had to live of her art from the beginning,
Ricky,
whether it
thank
would
you.
have been different.
Thank you. This is so helpful to me because it also reminds me something I wanted to say. There are people, so well, after her husband died in 1941, so she had years afterwards where she could have worked a lot, but she did in the design world. And she sold to Liberty department store and a major department store in Amsterdam. But she spent a lot of her time maintaining her husband's career, making sure that his work was exhibited, going around, trying to sell it. So she was devoted to him to the end. Who knows what she would have done? Yeah. It got especially hard for her during World War II because, well, her son declared he didn't even know till that she was Jewish, but she had to face a lot of ostracism. She was a tough lady. She just kept going. And toward the end, someone asked her if she was a feminist. She said, no, I'm just a woman artist.
Funny.
But I think she's a kind of model for feminism, frankly.
Yeah. She's marvelous.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maggie.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see you next week.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye.
Any
Thank
other
you.
questions? All right. Farewell.
Thank you. Bye-bye.